They said colonialism ended. They said France left Africa. But what if I told you, France never really left? What if I told you billions are still being siphoned from African nations every year, through a currency they don't control, through contracts they never signed, and through military coups they never saw coming? This isn't just history. This is happening right now in 2025. From Niger to Mali, Burkina Faso to Senegal, the same fingerprints appear after every collapse. France. This is the untold story of how France still steals billions from Africa and sponsors coups to keep it that way. After the so-called independence wave of the 1960s, most African nations believed they were finally free. Flags changed. National anthems played. Presidents were sworn in. But behind closed doors, France made sure the chains stayed on, just invisible this time. How? Through deals, debt, and most of all, the CFA franc. The CFA franc is a colonial currency born in 1945, and it's still in use today in 14 African countries. But here's the trap. All CFA countries must deposit 50% of their foreign reserves in the French treasury. France controls the value of the currency. France gets veto power over every African economic policy decision tied to the CFA. Imagine this: you're running a business, but your enemy owns your bank account, controls your wallet, and decides what you can or can't spend. That's what France did. That's what it's still doing. Meanwhile, billions of euros worth of African money sits in French banks, earning France interest, while African economies suffer. It's not just the CFA franc. French corporations like Total Energies, Areva, and Bouygues have dominated Africa's oil, uranium, and infrastructure sectors for decades. These aren't fair deals. They're takeovers dressed up as contracts. Example: Niger's uranium. Areva, now Orano, a French nuclear company, has mined uranium in Niger for 40 years. While France powers 70% of its energy from nuclear reactors, Niger, the source of that uranium, is one of the poorest countries on Earth. Anytime a leader threatens French interests, something strange happens. In 1963, Togo's first president Sylvanus Olympio tried to break from France. Days later, assassinated. In 1987, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso demanded independence from France, both economically and militarily. Months later, overthrown, killed. In 2023, Niger's government tried to push France out. 1 month later, a coup. These aren't coincidences. They're patterns. Military juntas appear, trained in French-linked academies, supported by French-aligned networks. France denies involvement, but the same actors, same regions, same goals keep reappearing. But something has changed. In 2023 and 2024, a new wave of African leadership rose up. From Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, to Assimi Goïta in Mali, to General Tiani in Niger, they formed the Alliance of Sahel States, AS. And they said, France, get out. They cut military ties. They expelled ambassadors. They nationalized resources. And most importantly, they started building their own economic and military independence. For the first time in 100 years, Africa is pushing back. But France doesn't give up easily, so it uses other tools like ECOWAS. When Niger overthrew its French-aligned government, ECOWAS, led by Nigeria and supported by France and the West, threatened military action. But Mali, Burkina, and Niger stood united. An attack on one is an attack on all. The threat of regional war became real, because France was fighting not just for power, but for billions in lost resources. Across Africa, protests erupted. From Senegal to Cameroon, people began demanding answers. Why are we still using a colonial currency? Why are our presidents answering to Paris? Why are our soldiers defending foreign interests? The era of quiet suffering is ending. The Pan-African awakening has begun. The future is uncertain. France still has power, still has money, still has influence. But Africa has something stronger now: unity. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the corridors of Bamako, a new generation of leaders, thinkers, and freedom fighters are rising. Their message is clear: we are not your colonies. We are sovereign nations, and we will take back what's ours. If you're African, or a friend of Africa, this story isn't just news. It's a call to action. Share it, speak about it, teach it, because silence is France's greatest weapon, and truth is Africa's strongest defense.
Welcome to African Diary 24, the channel where Africa speaks for itself. From powerful stories and rich cultures to political realities and grassroots movements, we bring you content that informs, inspires, and challenges the narrative. Whether you're here to learn, connect, or explore, you're in the right place. This is Africa, unfiltered, unapologetic, and rising. Hit that subscribe button and become part of the journey. Disclaimer: the content featured on African Diary 24 is for informational, educational, and documentary purposes only. We aim to represent stories with accuracy and integrity, but the views expressed in interviews or commentary do not necessarily reflect those of the channel. We do not promote hate, violence, or political bias. Viewer discretion is advised, especially for sensitive topics. Always do your own research and think critically.
On a scorching afternoon in the heart of Mali, a group of soldiers stands before the nation, their faces grim, their message clear. They have seized power, dissolved the constitution, and shut the borders. Once again, it is another coup d'etat, and the echoes of France resonate in the chaos. But why does France support these coups? Why does it keep a firm grip on Africa even after the fall of the colonial empires? Join me as we peel back the layers of this complex relationship. Another peculiarity of the CFA franc is that 50% of the reserves must be stored in France, effectively giving France considerable financial leverage over its former colonies. In addition, France receives a percentage of the profits earned by the central banks of these African countries. For instance, in 2018, it pocketed about 16 million euros from the Bank of Central African States. In 2020, a report published by an independent French research group alleged that French soldiers had carried out extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, and torture of suspected jihadists in Mali and Burkina Faso. The recent coup in Mali, which saw the military seize power and dissolve the government, is seen as a setback for France's efforts to stabilize the country and maintain its influence in the region. France had been working closely with Mali's government to counter the growing threat of jihadism and instability in the Sahel region. The coup has not only jeopardized these efforts, but also raised concerns about the future of France's role in Africa. Since 2020, the region has experienced a surge in violence and instability, with multiple countries descending into civil war and jihadist insurgencies. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad are among the countries most affected by this instability. And once again, France's fingerprints are all over it. The report also accused French forces of deliberately bombing civilians and civilian structures in violation of international law. The Malian army has been ill-equipped and poorly trained to handle the conflict, leading to widespread discontent and calls for reform. It has led to a massive humanitarian crisis, with hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes and in need of assistance. It has deployed thousands of troops to the region as part of counter-terrorism operations and has provided financial and technical assistance to the governments in the region. However, these efforts have not been enough to stabilize the region, and France's influence in Africa is waning as a result. It has also provided a breeding ground for extremist groups, making the region a hub for jihadism in Africa. Will it continue to prop up corrupt leaders and perpetuate the cycle of instability, or will it work to promote good governance and democracy in the region? Despite its promises of bringing light and progress, it has left a legacy of corruption, poverty, and instability. It is high time for African nations to break free from this cycle and chart their own course towards development and prosperity. Let us know what you think about France's role in Africa and what needs to change. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more insightful videos on African politics. Don't forget to subscribe and share for more updates. Together, let's build a better Africa. Only time will tell. This instability culminated in 2 coups d'etat in less than a year, with the most recent one occurring in May 2021. The coup leaders accused the previous government of corruption and incompetence and promised to restore order and stability. However, their actions have been widely condemned by the international community, including France, which has suspended its military cooperation with Mali, but rather the internal power struggles and corruption that have been exacerbated by France's exploitative policies. Jihadist groups have launched a series of attacks against the government, leading to a crackdown by the security forces and a deteriorating human rights situation. His son and successor, Mohammed Idris Deby, has been accused of clinging to power and suppressing dissent, leading to protests and calls for a return to civilian rule. The instability culminated in a coup d'etat in January 2022, with the coup leaders accusing the government of failing to protect the country from the jihadist threat. By controlling the CFA franc and maintaining a strong military presence, France has been able to exert significant influence over the political and economic affairs of African countries, often at their expense. These allegations have strained relations between France and some African countries, with some accusing France of using its counter-terrorism operations as a cover to maintain its colonial-era dominance in Africa. It has done so through a variety of means, including the CFA franc, military intervention, and support for corrupt leaders. As a result, many African countries remain poor and unstable despite having abundant natural resources. 11 million euros from the West African Monetary Agency and a further €4 million from the BEAC, all thanks to the CFA franc system. To put this in perspective, if France were a shareholder in these central banks, it would have earned a dividend equivalent to 20%, an amount higher than what some long-term shareholders receive. This financial arrangement highlights the continued economic influence France wields over its former colonies, drawing criticism that it exploits these nations for its own benefit. Mali's story is not an isolated one. It is a symptom of a deep malaise that has been gripping the continent for years. France also has a significant stake in the mining industries of many African countries, particularly in Mali, where it owns 40% of the state-owned B2Gold company. This ownership stems from a 2018 agreement that granted French companies access to the vast mineral resources of Mali in exchange for investments in infrastructure and education. However, critics argue that this deal is another example of neocolonialism, where France uses its historical ties to secure lucrative business deals that benefit French companies at the expense of Malian development. Since the 2011 Arab Spring uprisings, the Sahel region of Africa has descended into turmoil, with at least 8 successful coups and many more attempted. France maintains a significant military presence in Mali as part of its fight against jihadism in the Sahel region. It has around 5,000 troops stationed in the country as part of the Group Task Force Takuba, a coalition of 30 countries, including Mali, formed to combat terrorism and organized crime in the region. France's military involvement in Mali goes back to 2013, when it intervened in the conflict in northern Mali, helping the Malian army to push back the separatist rebels and jihadists who had seized large parts of the country. France's intervention was seen as crucial in restoring stability in Mali and preventing the spread of Islamist extremism in the region. Despite its name, which pays homage to the colonial past, the CFA franc is deeply entwined with the modern-day exploitation of Africa, and used by 8 West African nations, and the CFA franc, pegged to the French franc and used by 6 Central African nations. What makes this currency unique and perhaps controversial is the fact that African countries have no independent monetary policy. Their central banks cannot print additional money to stimulate their economy. Instead, they must rely on the Bank of France to print CFA francs, which are then stored in French and African banks in both physical and digital forms. This means that African governments have very limited control over their own currency supply, leaving them vulnerable to external manipulations. Let us take a closer look at the structure of this currency system and how it impacts African economies. At the center of this storm is Mali, a country that holds the key to understanding the broader issues at play. And as we dissect the recent events in this nation, we start to uncover the hidden hand that pulls the strings from afar. The first chapter of this saga dates back to 1945, when France introduced the CFA franc, a currency that remains the official currency of 14 African countries today. There are two main varieties of the CFA franc, the XOF, pegged to the euro, but that's not all. But the story doesn't end there. In addition to its financial stake in Mali's mining industry, France also has strong military ties to the country. However, France's military presence in Mali has been controversial due to allegations of human rights abuses committed by French troops. Despite these controversies, France remains a key player in the region with significant economic and political influence. What is becoming increasingly clear is that the real threat to African countries is not necessarily the jihadist groups or other external forces. The truth is that since the end of formal colonialism, France has continued to exploit African resources and labor for its own benefit. Let's turn our attention now to the wider Sahel region, where the situation is even more dire. In Mali, the instability has been exacerbated by a long-running conflict between the central government and various separatist and jihadist groups in the north of the country. In Burkina Faso, the instability has been driven by a combination of factors, including ethnic tensions, poverty, and the activities of jihadist groups. Chad, too, has been grappling with instability following the death of President Idriss Déby in April 2021. The instability in the Sahel region has had far-reaching consequences. France, meanwhile, has been caught off guard by the instability and has scrambled to contain the crisis. As the situation in the Sahel region continues to deteriorate, it remains to be seen what role France will play in addressing the crisis. It's clear that France's legacy of colonialism continues to haunt Africa.